I stood in the marble lobby, the kind that made every sound echo like a judgment. The paper in my hand felt heavier than it should have, an itemized bill I never approved, stamped with numbers that made my stomach twist. Pierce leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear as he whispered, "Just sign it, Mom. It's nothing." Then, before I could ask what he meant, he slipped through the revolving door and vanished into the morning glare outside. For a heartbeat, I waited for him to come back. He didn't. The young clerk behind the counter tilted her head, watching my confusion ripple into panic. When I tried to speak, my voice cracked. There must be a mistake. I can't pay this. She glanced at the total, just under $10,000, and signaled discreetly to the security guard. He stepped closer, folding his arms as if preparing for trouble. People slowed their steps to look. Some whispered. A couple near the fountain lifted their phones, recording the scene as if my confusion were entertainment. My vision blurred at the edges. Pierce had told me this weekend was a gift, a chance for us to repair years of distance. I had believed him. Now, every moment clicked together differently, the way he never let me see the check, how he ushered me quickly away from the front desk, how his smile never reached his eyes. "Ma'am," the receptionist said gently. "Cash or card?" My hands trembled so badly the bill fluttered. I didn't have $10,000. I barely had enough to cover next month's rent. My mouth opened, but the words stuck. Then an older man stepped out from the back office, his blazer worn at the cuffs, his eyes sharp with recognition. He approached with careful steps, studying my face as though searching for memories there. "Are you related to Jonathan Hale?" he asked. Everything around me dimmed, sounds stretching thin, the lobby swaying slightly. I had never heard that name, but the way he waited, as if he expected me to understand, made something cold settle in my chest. And before I could gather myself enough to answer, he nodded as though he already knew the truth and motioned for me to step aside with him, away from the watching eyes and the bill still trembling in my hand. The older man guided me a few steps away from the counter, his voice low as if he were protecting something fragile. "My name is Dane Whitlock," he said. "I've worked here for 30 years. I nodded, unsure why he thought that mattered, until he added, more gently, "I knew your father." The air thinned. My mother had never spoken a name, not once in 63 years. Whatever expression crossed my face must have confirmed that truth for him. He motioned toward a quiet seating nook near the far wall. I followed because standing in the center of that lobby any longer felt unbearable. When we sat, Dane folded his hands and spoke with a steadiness that made everything around us fall away. "Jonathan Hale," he explained, "once owned the land beneath this hotel. Before he died, he left a very specific instruction. If a woman named Elizabeth Rowan ever arrived here alone and in visible distress, an envelope was to be given to her. My name. My distress. A man I had never known. I felt my pulse falter. Then Dane said something that made my stomach twist harder. 2 months earlier, Pierce had visited and asked questions about an old Hale trust. Pierce had stood in this very lobby, digging for answers I didn't even know existed. Pieces of the weekend began to rearrange themselves, the sudden affection, the lavish treatments. His insistence I just enjoy it. He had planned this, or at least planned for it to end differently. The hotel manager strode over then, eyes sharp as he referenced the bill still on my account. My throat tightened again, but Dane lifted a hand. He asked the manager to place the charges onto a legacy ledger tied to Hale's former estate. The manager hesitated, then granted it with visible annoyance. "Take a breath," Dane murmured. I wasn't sure I could. He slipped a weathered envelope into my hands. My name appeared in angular handwriting I'd never seen. Inside lay a key and a slip of paper. "When she is ready," She will find the rest at storage unit 4C. Dane sighed. Your son didn't find what he wanted. He left upset. I walked out into the sunlight with the key pressed so tightly into my palm, it left a mark, already sensing the next step I needed to take. The bus rattled through late morning traffic, each bump jarring the questions already spinning inside me. I watched storefronts blur past the window and tried to understand how Pierce, my only child, the boy who once clung to my hand crossing streets, had grown into someone capable of staging my humiliation in a hotel lobby. I didn't let myself linger long in old memories. They offered no comfort now. Whatever pain I carried belonged entirely to this moment, not the past. When I reached my apartment, a small pile of envelopes waited beneath the door. Past due notices, payment reminders, quiet witnesses to years of stretching every dollar. I stepped over them. Too drained to open anything yet, I thought of everything I had poured into Pierce's life. When he wanted to start his business, I sold the last of my jewelry without hesitation. I worked back-to-back shifts at the laundromat and cleaned apartments on weekends. Just to cover the overdraft fees he pretended weren't his fault. For a while, he called me every day, his voice warm, grateful. But as months passed, the calls changed. Gratitude thinned, impatience grew, a sigh here, a clipped tone there, until conversations felt like obligations he resented. Now, in the quiet of my apartment, the recent weeks came into sharp focus: the sudden invitation to the hotel, the too sweet politeness, the way he pushed luxury on me as though he needed me dazzled. None of it had been generosity. It had been preparation. I sat at the table and studied the key again. The numbers 4C were stamped crookedly into the metal, as if by an impatient hand. Storage units in this city held all kinds of histories, rarely simple ones. Why had Jonathan Hale left something for a daughter no one ever acknowledged existed? And why had Pierce tried to reach it first? My phone buzzed. You misunderstood. Call me. I deleted the message without reading it twice. The key lay on the table, catching a sliver of light from the window, waiting like a doorway into a truth someone had worked hard to keep hidden, and a truth I could no longer ignore as I prepared for the next steps. By the next morning, a quiet resolve had settled over me. I boarded the bus headed east, watching the city center fade into a maze of warehouses and loading docks. The air grew heavier the farther we traveled, carrying the sharp tang of metal and the dull scent of dust that clung to forgotten corners of Los Angeles. Rows of storage units stretched along the street, their numbers peeling in the sun. I walked along the gravel path until I reached 4C. The padlock was stiff, rusted around the edges. It resisted twice before finally giving way with a grinding protest. When I pulled the door up, the metal shrieked through the empty corridor. Inside, darkness swallowed everything at first. My eyes adjusted slowly to the outline of a folding table and several boxes stacked with deliberate precision. This was not the chaos of an abandoned unit. Someone had arranged these things to be found. I opened the smallest box. Inside were property records bearing Jonathan Hale's signature parcels of land purchased long before the hotel existed. Beneath them lay letters written in a careful, looping hand by a woman I didn't recognize. She mentioned a child named Elizabeth, but never spoke of Hale directly, only hinting at late-night visits and a relationship kept in shadows. The next envelope held a birth certificate, my name, my mother's name. The father line deliberately left blank, but taped to the back was a narrow slip of paper. Jonathan Hale verified guardianship privately. The words struck me like a physical blow. My mother hadn't merely avoided speaking his name. She had erased it for a reason I could only begin to guess. I moved to the final box, lifting the lid with trembling fingers. Photographs lay inside. In one, my mother stood beside a man I now recognized from online images of Hale. Her expression strained, distant, as though burdened by something she could neither share nor escape. At the bottom of the box, a set of documents caught my attention. They were dated 6 months earlier. Requests for archival access. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Pierce Rowan. My son had walked into this truth long before I ever touched the door to foresee, and the realization carried me into the silence that followed as I braced myself for what came next. I was halfway through a stack of old tax documents when a metallic clang echoed from somewhere outside. It wasn't the casual rattle of another unit door. This sound carried intention. I froze, listening as slow, deliberate footsteps approached the open entrance. Instinct made me reach up and flick off the overhead light. The unit fell into a dim hush, the kind that makes every breath feel too loud. A shadow filled the doorway. I knew you'd come eventually. Pierce. He stepped inside with the self-assurance of someone who believed the space belonged to him. In the muted light, he looked different. Sharper around the eyes, thinner, as though he hadn't been sleeping. His gaze swept over the boxes and papers with a hungry intensity. "You have no idea what you're holding," he said. Hale wasn't some forgotten man. He had land, trusts, money that's still out there. And you? He jabbed a finger toward me. You were never meant to keep any of it. Mom never told you the truth, so how could you possibly deserve it? I'm the one who should claim this, not you. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. His voice grew harsher with every breath I didn't answer. He accused me of arriving too soon, of disrupting his plans, of ruining everything before it even started. Then he said the part that cut deepest, that hotel weekend. You think I did that for you? I needed you overwhelmed, buried, too embarrassed to chase anything tied to Hale. It was supposed to make this easier. I felt the room tilt slightly as he stepped forward, reaching for the envelope still in my hand. His fingers brushed mine, cold and urgent. But before he could pull it away, another voice drifted out from the shadows behind a stack of metal shelves. She doesn't owe you anything. I spun toward the sound. A tall man with silver streaks in his hair stepped into view, his posture steady, his gaze fixed on Pierce. My name is Rowan Hale, he said quietly, and she's my sister. The envelope slipped against my palm as the weight of his words carried me toward whatever truth waited next. Rowan Hale didn't move until Pierce backed several steps away, his expression flickering between anger and calculation. Only then did Rowan turn to me, offering a steadiness I hadn't felt since stepping into the unit. He spoke calmly, as though he'd rehearsed this moment for years. He explained that he had uncovered fragments of our father's hidden records long ago, old ledgers, notarized statements, and private agreements scattered across different counties. The pieces had led him here, to this unit, to the past. Jonathan Hale never claimed publicly. He said he'd been monitoring the archives tied to Hale's holdings. When someone submitted a request for access, someone using Pierce's information, Rowan took notice. He began visiting the storage facility each evening, waiting for whoever was bold or desperate enough to return. Pierce shifted near the doorway, agitated. You're twisting everything. I was just trying to understand what she's owed, he snapped. But Rowan remained unmoved. There are rules tied to this estate, Rowan said evenly. Any heir who deceives, manipulates, or exploits another loses every claim. Your actions are already documented. He wasn't bluffing. From a small folder tucked under his arm, Rowan revealed notes, dates, and digital timestamps. Pierce's forged attempts to submit my signature, the suspicious hotel charges, the sudden blocks he placed on his number each time I tried to call. and the quiet way he had followed me financially, waiting for the right moment to push. Pierce denied each accusation, but his eyes darted too quickly, landing nowhere for long. I listened as Rowan described our father's life, a man who maintained multiple households discreetly, leaving a tangled legacy of silence and scattered clues. My mother hadn't withheld his name out of spite. She had shielded me from a world built on secrecy. Rowan turned to me gently. "You don't have to navigate this alone. I can help you review everything properly." Before I could answer, Pierce pulled a sheaf of papers from his jacket power of representation. He claimed, "Just sign. I'll sort all of this for you." I stepped back. Rowan stepped forward. Pierce's voice rose, sharp and wounded. Then he spun around and stormed out, his threat lingering like a shadow. I stared at Rowan, the ground shifting beneath everything I thought I knew, as he quietly urged me to gather what I needed before leaving the unit together. Rowan drove me back toward the city in his old pickup, the engine humming steadily beneath us. He spoke without embellishment, laying out what he knew about the remnants of our father's estate. There was no hidden fortune waiting to change anyone's life overnight. What remained were land rights tied up in old agreements, a trust with strict conditions, and dormant accounts that required formal hearings before anything could be released. It wasn't wealth, he said. It was responsibility, one that came with the weight of legal processes and the history attached to them. When we reached my apartment, the familiar creak of the stairs grounded me. I carried the boxes inside and set them on the table. Rowan stayed only long enough to help me separate the documents into categories: property, correspondence, trust records, and everything relating to Hale's personal dealings. My phone buzzed again and again beside me. Messages from Pierce stacked on the screen. Apologies, accusations, promises, then thinly veiled threats. I blocked each number as it appeared. Rowan watched quietly. He may escalate, he warned. People who feel cornered often do. He handed me a business card. "Worn at the corners. Call me before you speak with anyone else. I'll go with you to every meeting." His steadiness startled me, not because it felt unfamiliar, but because it felt like something I'd been missing for far too long. A presence that didn't demand or manipulate, only supported. We agreed to meet an estate lawyer the next morning. After he left, the apartment felt both heavier and more open, as though the truths stacked on my table had finally been given permission to breathe. I sat for hours, papers spread before me, unable to close my eyes. The betrayal from the hotel had been sharp, but this was deeper, slower. A realization that Pierce hadn't just left me humiliated. He had tried to erase a future I hadn't even known belonged to me. I lifted the faded photograph of my mother, her expression distant, carrying something she never spoke aloud. I wondered how much of my life had been shaped by her silence, and how much I was willing to uncover now that the choice was mine. The first light of dawn settled through the window as I prepared myself for the day ahead, ready to stand beside Rowan in whatever came next. Rowan and I arrived at the law office just before 9. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every footstep sound like a declaration. Miriam Lowell greeted us with a nod, sharp-eyed, calm, and clearly accustomed to sorting out the tangles left behind by families like ours. She invited us into a conference room, then began reviewing the documents Rowan and I laid before her. Her hands moved steadily through each page. No surprise, no judgment, only the cool efficiency of someone who had seen worse than forged signatures and fractured bloodlines. When she finished her initial review, she scheduled a preliminary hearing to determine the rightful heirs. Before I could collect my thoughts, the door opened behind us. Pierce walked in with a polished folder tucked under his arm and a smile stretched too tightly across his face. "I thought I should be here," he said, "to help sort things out." He sat across from me, straightening the papers as though he were the one guiding the process. He spoke to Miriam with a practiced tone, presenting himself as the responsible party in a family misunderstanding. Miriam listened without giving him anything in return. When he finished, Rowan slid a different set of documents across the table, screenshots, timestamps, copies of requests Pierce had filed under false pretenses, and a statement outlining the hotel incident. As Rowan explained each point, Pierce's composure thinned. His voice cracked when he defended himself, insisting he meant well, that he only acted out of desperation, that everything he did was to secure what should have been his to manage. I said nothing. The silence between us felt like a wall built brick by brick over the years. Miriam closed the folder with finality. Mr. Rowan attempted to influence inheritance through deceptive means. His rights are suspended pending full review. Pierce turned to me then, something raw and wounded flickering in his eyes. You chose a stranger over your own son, he whispered. The hearing ended. Rowan guided me outside, letting the cool air settle around us. Only then did the truth land fully. Pierce had betrayed me by choice, but the desperation behind it came from a place I still couldn't see clearly, one I wasn't sure he ever intended to reveal as we prepared for what the next hearing might bring. The weeks that followed moved slowly, measured by phone calls from the lawyer's office and the steady rustle of papers Rowan and I sorted through each afternoon. I stopped expecting to see Pierce's name on my phone. The silence he left behind settled into something I could finally breathe around. Most days, I focused on the estate records, letting the details give shape to a past I had never been allowed to see. Rowan and I uncovered more about Hale's holdings, scattered parcels of land that had been divided among business partners long before his death, and a trust so modest it almost felt symbolic. Its instructions were clear. Only direct descendants in good standing could receive anything for the first time. I understood this wasn't about inheritance in the way Pierce imagined. It wasn't about money. It was about acknowledging a lineage built on secrecy and deciding what to do with what little remained. One evening, as I returned from work, a letter waited in my mailbox. The handwriting was Pierce's. I carried it upstairs and sat at the kitchen table before opening it. It held no accusations, no threats. Just a single page where he explained the truth he hadn't spoken aloud. He had fallen into debt after a failed partnership. He had believed securing control of my share would save him, and he resented me for not telling him about a father I never knew myself. I read it twice, trying to understand the shape of his hurt. Rowan, when I showed him, told me gently that I didn't owe a reply. Sometimes silence was the only boundary left. Later that night, I walked through the neighborhood as the sun faded behind the buildings. I tried to pinpoint when trust between Pierce and me had shifted, whether it began with my mother's silence or with Pierce's own hunger for something unnamed. The answer stayed just out of reach. When the estate finally approved my portion of the trust, I felt no triumph and no grief. Only a quiet settling inside me, as though the past had loosened its grip and allowed me, at last, to decide how to step forward as the next chapter waited for me to enter it. Months passed before I felt ready to visit the land that once tied Jonathan Hale to a past I could barely piece together. What remained of it had been reshaped into a modest park, winding paths, a few benches, patches of worn grass. Nothing grand. Nothing that hinted at the secrets once buried beneath it. I carried only a thin folder under my arm, the last of the documents I intended to file away before closing this chapter. For good. Rowan was already waiting near the entrance. He greeted me with a quiet nod, and we fell into step together without the need for explanations. The park was still at this hour, save for the rustle of wind through branches and the hum of distant traffic. We walked for a long while before he spoke. He told me he planned to start a community program in Hale's name, something simple and steady. A fund for families fractured by instability. Workshops for young people trying to navigate the gaps left by parents who couldn't or didn't stay. If we're going to carry his name, he said, it should mean something that helps someone else. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the hollow myths often left behind by men like Hale. Men who moved through their lives creating shadows that other people had to rebuild themselves from. Rowan's idea felt like an act of rewriting, not erasing. As for my portion of the trust, I knew exactly what I wanted. Not reinvention, not a dramatic change, just repairs to my apartment, a financial cushion I had never allowed myself, and the quiet independence I had surrendered again and again in the name of motherhood. It felt like claiming a room I had been waiting outside of my entire life. I hadn't heard from Pierce since the letter. I no longer knew whether reconciliation belonged in my future or whether letting the distance remain was its own kind of mercy. What I did know was that I could no longer build my life around someone else's demands or absences. When I left the park, the air felt lighter. My steps steadied, not because I carried answers, but because I finally walked without waiting for permission from a past that had lost its hold, moving toward whatever came next with a quiet certainty, taking root beneath my feet.